All right, so all of your midterm grades are posted. I have to say the school does not make it all that convenient to upload your midterm and or final grades. On LoudCloud, they have you sorted by name, like by your first name. And then on the grade portal, you're sorted by your last name. So it makes it real convenient to be able to go back and forth between the two. So that's always fun. We still have to do it manually too, which isn't, I don't like that at all. All right, got your second exam this week. So you don't need to do any BLAs since your exam kind of is your BLA. I'll be reviewing for that here at the end. So any questions on any of all that? All right, so I wanted to start off by kind of going over your term paper here. Now, this isn't due for a little while. Yeah, so you got still a whole month left. But I figured I want to at least go over this with you, so at least you know kind of what to expect here. All right, so in lab, you write a biotech paper. And here, what you're essentially doing is you're going to do a paper on really any kind of really an analysis you would do of movement. That can be for really any activity, for sport, or what have you. But essentially, that's the short of it. You're doing a full-on assessment of a particular movement. So when it comes to, first off, picking your topic, make it something that's very specific and concise. So you don't want to be stuck with doing, like, say, a 10-step analysis kind of thing. So for example, let's say you're doing, a volleyball player. You would just want to do essentially someone that's striking the ball some way. And you don't need to break it down into, like I said, 30 different stages. You can really go into like 4 to 6 total steps with that. Your main focus should be on the action happening, not too terribly worried about all the peripheral stuff. So for example, if I'm hitting a volleyball, like say doing an overhand hit, most likely I'm in the air, so I'm jumping. So the majority of the analysis should be focused on, say, like trunk rotation and your shoulder action. Does that kind of make sense? You would still want to mention that, oh, by the way, I had to jump to get there, but that doesn't need to be the main focus of your analysis. You want to analyze what's directly causing the movement, kind of thing. Now, if you want to do something multi-step, like say like an Olympic style weight lift, like a power clean, a clean and jerk, snatch, something like that, I mean, by all means, go for it. But you're just kind of making a lot more work for yourself because you have so many different steps that you have to analyze, and you're essentially using your whole body for virtually every one of them. So go ahead and do it. I mean, more power to you, but just so you are well aware, that's going to be considerably more work than something that has less steps to it. Now, what you shouldn't do are things that clearly don't need a movement analysis. So if you're doing something like, say, a single joint exercise, that's really not going to cut it. You want to do something that has some complexity to it, meaning you want to have at minimum a total body movement. The entire motion doesn't need to be total body. So again, like if I'm doing a volleyball hit, like a volleyball spike, I have to jump in the air, but once I'm in the air, I'm not using my legs anymore. So like I said, main analysis on trunk and arm, but I still had to use my legs. So total body. Doing something like, say, a biceps curl. I mean, yeah, I guess technically that could be something you analyze like in general, but that's too simple or too basic really for this. So your movement needs to have a total body component to it. Still with me? All right. Now, for the way you're structuring this is you should have this in APA formatting. So I love how they have here a bibliography. I wonder if I can change that. Oh, sweet. Biomechanicals. So you should have 5 section headers. This is probably the one thing about like APA formatting that is probably something that gets like, it'll get to me the most. Meaning if you don't use section headers, it makes it very difficult to follow your train of thought. I know when you're doing like, say, a creative writing or some sort of, fictional type writing that, story flows and all that kind of thing, you shouldn't necessarily have abrupt changes. But in research, you do. So make sure you use your section headers. Remember, your introduction isn't a section header you use the title of your paper. Now, I know this is 1,500 to 3,000 words. I'm not going to be, counting every single word or anything like that, even though documents do that for you. But I just want to make sure that you should make sure that you have the content you need. So if you can say something in 4 words rather than 10, I'm all for it. But just make sure those are 4 quality words kind of thing. Don't just stretch out a paper for the sake of putting extra words on there to get a word count up. Now, your introduction should probably be the shortest part of this. Essentially, all you want to state here is really what you're going to analyze, why you think that needs an analysis. The literature review. So it does say that you need a minimum of 5 peer-reviewed sources. Again, I'm not too worried if you get all 5. I mean, at minimum, you're going to need at least 2. But, the more the merrier. The easiest way to figure out what's a scholarly source, scholarly sources are either textbooks or articles that have a DOI number. That's pretty much the easiest way to think of it. The main thing people will really kind of mess up on with their source material is when they use websites that happen to be like, say, a sales site. So especially when you get into like any kind of medical device sales, that kind of thing, you'll see like these web pages that look academic in nature, but it's really just, a sales kind of site. I don't think anyone's going to sell a product where they don't say it's the best thing, in the world. So be cautious of that. You don't really want to be using things like blogs or whatnot. And really, there's plenty of research on movement analysis for everything. Now, for your actual analysis, what I would be doing is either, say, taking a video or a series of still images and using those to essentially reflect your analysis. This is going to make it a lot easier when you're trying to describe all the different movements, because you'll have at least a reference for that, and you'll be able to show that this is the distinct phase I'm in for that. The way I would format it would be to essentially make a series of tables, just like you did with all the different, well, I guess you do it more in lab when it's, do a kinematic analysis of whatever, the volleyball serve, state all your movements, the muscles that are being used, all that good stuff. And then the actual written portion of that, I would just essentially do a kind of a detailed overview of what that is. So the analysis, the actual kinematic analysis itself doesn't need to be so involved in terms of say written text, but you want to have essentially a picture of where you're at, a table of what you're doing, and then an explanation of what that all means. Does that make sense? Now, you don't, like I said, you don't have to do that, but I'm just letting you know it's probably the easiest way to do this. For the discussion here, this is where you're going to essentially pull out what everything means. So what your literature review along with your actual analysis will mean for our better understanding of movement of that activity. This bit here, where you provide any kind of recommendations or whatnot, especially looking at different ways that you could improve on that activity, that's where you want to put that in there. And then in the conclusion here, summary findings, brief results, okay. The results really should kind of be in more the actual analysis itself, or even in the discussion. But you want to really touch on in your conclusion there, any potential, say, limitations you would have, future research, that kind of thing. So, I mean, pretty straightforward here. It is worth 15% of your grade, so, kind of important. But what kind of questions do you have on this so far?
Do the honors students need to do the honors things?
Yeah.
Okay.
And I forget exactly what it is, but yeah, you do.
Presentation.
Yeah, and you're not gonna have to present to the class. What you can do is video yourself and send that to me. Yeah.
You said you taught exercise physiology, right?
Yeah.
Is it pretty similar structure to the term paper for the with literature review, analysis, and discussion?
Yeah, I mean, for the most part. Yeah, it's just really that the major focus on this is with the movement analysis part. So that's kind of the big difference there. Because I believe the XPhys one goes over more of, like say, the physiological and performance implications. I could be wrong. It's been like 2 years since I've taught that class. But yeah, I do know what you're talking about though. And please make sure you are submitting your own work. I can't tell you how many times that people try to recycle papers and it doesn't work anymore. Yeah, so just don't do that. All right, so that's everything with all of that. And again, that's not due till April 4th, so still quite some time. All right, so let's get into the hip here again. All right, so last time we covered most everything with the hip. Now remember that we have, I guess, technically 5 bones that we're dealing with the hip and pelvis proper. I mean 6 if you want to count the coccyx. But what are the bones that are making up my pelvic girdle as a whole?
Ilium, ischium, and pubis.
Yep, there's my pelvis. And what are my other 2 bones that are going to be in there?
The sacrum and coccyx.
Sacrum, coccyx, yeah, and then my femur. Coccyx does nothing, so it's pretty useless. Just the appendix of our skeletal system kind of thing. That being said, I wouldn't want to break it or anything, but still, coccyx does nothing. Sacrum, remember that your sacrum moves at your SI joint, your sacroiliac joint. The ilium is the most important pelvic bone for at least our purposes here. How much and in what direction is the sacrum going to move? No, not at all. Sacrum moves around about 1 to 3 millimeters total, and it will tilt in the same direction as the pelvis. So if the pelvis tilts anteriorly, the sacrum tilts anteriorly. If the pelvis tilts posteriorly, sacrum tilts posteriorly. So they both move the same direction. All right, what's different between the acetabular femoral joint and the glenohumeral joint?
Deeper,
In what regard?
like the socket isn't so shallow, so it's more stable, but less mobile.
Bony stability, yes. So, yeah, all in all, the hip's bigger than the shoulder, but the only real difference we have there is that you have actual bony stability in the hip that you don't have in the shoulder. Shoulder has more mobility, hip has more stability. And then my muscles. So major muscles we had there are your glutes, your hamstrings, your quads, your hip flexors, and then your ab adductors. So what is my main hip extensor?
Gluteus maximus.
Yes, glute max. And my main hip flexor? Iliopsoas, perfect. And then what are my major adductor muscles? So they're the ones that all say adductor on them. So your adductor magnus is probably the number one. Where are we? There we go. And then what are my major abductor muscles?
Gluteus medius.
And
Tensor fasciae.
yep, TFL, glute medius, your two main abductors. My main external rotators.
Gluteus maximus, medius, and piriformis.
Yep. Max and medius, definitely the primary ones. Piriformis, synergist. But yes, that will move it. And then internal rotators.
Minimus.
Medius minimus. So remember, glute medius does everything except adduction. Glute max, your major extensor and external rotator. Medius does everything except adduction. All right, and then what do my quads do?
Some hip flexion.
Yes, they will assist with hip flexion. And then how about my hamstrings?
Some hip extension.
Yes, they will assist with hip extension. Very good. And then remember that your femur is the cutoff line between flexion and extension. Anything anterior to the femur is going to flex the hip. Anything posterior to the femur is going to extend the hip. All right, it doesn't fit so well into like anything, but where is it? Well, I don't even have it in here. Probably because it's more on the spine, but quadratus lumborum will actually be here. So it attaches to the posterior superior iliac crest, and then it'll insert onto the spine and lower ribs. Quadratus lumborum does your hip hike, so it allows you to pull that hip up. All right, Sartorius and Gracilis. Sartorius is going to be a little bit misleading, even though it comes inside here. So even though, you know, it has its origin over here, and then it inserts really on the lateral to medial tibia, it doesn't do anything for hip adduction. And again, the drawings are a little bit misleading because it's a lot more anterior than what your drawings will tell you, kind of thing. So Sartorius is primarily going to act as an external rotator, and it'll assist with hip flexion. Gracilis is going to do more your adduction. So for Gracilis is coming straight down the side here. Oh, and then remember that for TFL, you have your major tendon there, which is your oh my gosh, why am I spacing on the word now? The hell's a tendon for your TFL? IT band, there we go, thank you. Whew. Remember with the IT band, if you have any sort of IT band pathology or IT band syndrome, you're gonna feel pain at the lateral knee. You're not gonna feel it in your thigh. All right. And then we went over most all this. I wanted to touch real quick on these gait forces here again. So we talked about this a little bit last week, but remember that your really gait and your overall mechanics of ambulation are going to dictate how efficiently you transfer really your body weight through movement. The harder you walk or the harder you run, the more impact you're going to have. So you want to minimize that to preserve lower extremity joint integrity. For the most part, like the ankles tend to not be the ones affected so much by degenerative changes. They're the ones that are usually you're going to injure traumatically. So ankle sprain is, especially an inversion ankle sprain where you roll on the outside of your ankle. That's going to be the most common ankle injury you have. But that again is traumatic. It's not overuse. You can have overuse, like related changes to the ankle, but it's a lot more rare than say like knee, hip degenerative changes. So knee and hip are the two that are most impacted by forceful impact. We talked a little bit about how if you had like say osteopenia or osteoporosis, you don't want to be doing any major high impact exercise because that can further exacerbate that. You need impact on your bones so that you continually grow them. So your bones constantly break down and build back up. They do that through impact. So if you were in essentially, you know, a gravity eliminated plane, your bone density would break down because you wouldn't have any real mechanism to build it back up. You need to have impact, or you need to have some sort of force acting on the bones themselves if you want the bones to essentially reconstruct themselves. Otherwise, they just kind of keep breaking down and your world turns into WALL-E. Let's see, hitting your heel is the most forceful thing you can do. So if you're like, say, running or even jumping and you land on your heels, that's the most amount of impact you can have on yourself, just because it's the lowest amount of surface area. So you get more of that direct shock from that. And the only reason why you actually hit your heels, especially when walking or running, is because you wear shoes. If you were barefoot, or if you had very like minimalist soles, you would land much more flat-footed. We'll see though the trade-off of that when we get into like gait, and especially like the foot and ankle, because you'll see how you can easily get shin splints from that. All right, here's the number to remember though. Degeneration of the hip is associated with at least a 3 times body weight forceful impact or greater. Now, this doesn't mean that, you, I don't know, jump 10 feet off a building and land safely once, and then your hips are on the fast track for degeneration. But this just means that with excessive use and excessive force impact on it, that's where you're going to see that. And if you think about it, how many people do you really see doing, let's say, like plyometric exercises in their 40s and 50s? I mean, a very, very small percentage of the population that actually exercises is going to do that. That's just because, as you age, things change and body tends to take a little bit longer to recover on some of those bigger or more forceful type of exercise routines. All right, and then like I said, don't worry about this here so much. And I wanted to kind of finish up with our Q angle and our ranges of motion. All right, well, it's not really showing it there, but that's okay. Might be probably because it's covered more in the knee. All right, here we go. See, why is it so hard to get a picture of just, your kind of hip and leg? All right, Q angle or your quadriceps angle, remember, is essentially how wide set your hips are. When you're measuring a Q angle, you're going from your ASIS to your patella to your tibial tuberosity. That is your measurement there. If my patella were to extend straight up and pretend that's a straight line, then this here is my Q angle. Now, what's a Q angle actually good for? So what does your Q angle actually tell you other than, hip width? So your Q angle is going to tell you essentially how stable your knee is inherently. The wider the Q angle or the larger the Q angle, the less stable the knee is. And that's just because if you can imagine the femur being offset, you can see how that would impact the stability there of the knee. Your tibia, which is straight, and then if you have your femur coming at an angle, that doesn't make things all that stable for you. So the less your Q angle, the straighter the femur to tibia alignment is, the more stable inherently your knee is going to be. This is partially the reason why, like, say, men tend to have a lower Q angle or a smaller Q angle than women. Women need wider set hips to give birth. And women are also roughly 2 to 3 times more likely to injure their ACLs than a male would in a similar activity. Your norms for Q angle are going to vary slightly. Typically, it's going to be 11 to 14 for men, 11 to 14 degrees, and for women, it'll be 17 to 23. If you remember, because you did the hip lab already, right? If you remember from lab, there was a post-lab question asking what the difference was between taking your Q angle when you stand versus laying down. And what difference did you actually find? If you can recall.
I didn't personally find that much of a difference, but when I looked it up, it said that standing was being a greater Q than lying down.
And why is that?
The forces on your joints.
Kind of, yeah. Now, your body itself isn't going to, change or whatever, metamorphosize into something else just because you're laying down versus standing up. So any changes you see from like something like a Q angle from sitting to standing are kind of meaningless because your inherent structure of your body isn't changing. So even, and I just had one little bit here. So this is suggesting here that Q angle is going to change from lateral forces pulling on the patella if you are sitting versus standing, or laying down versus standing. But really, this whole article just says that the only difference that was found was just in the goniometer measurements of it, not of anything of the actual function, like the like say the force impact on it, the overall forces interacting like with the knee, with the hip, none of that changes. So even though, like say when you were laying down versus standing up, yeah, the goniometer measurement will change, but the actual function doesn't. So it's not as though like say you're stronger or weaker in one position or the other, it's just going to be slightly different. And we'll come back to that a little bit later when we talk about the knee. So that'll be, I believe, next week. And then again with your norms here. So flexion up to 120. Extension should be around about 30 degrees. Adduction, 20 to 45 degrees. And then your rotation, it'll vary slightly, but around about 45 degrees, both internally and external. And remember, whenever the knee's flexed and the lower leg moves, your hip is going to move opposites of the lower leg. So, knees flexed, I move my lower leg medially. What direction does my hip move? Laterally, yes. If I move my lower leg laterally, my hip moves in what direction? Medially, yes. If my knee's extended, then lower leg and hip follow the exact same trajectory. It's only when we have knee flexion that that changes. And then last thing here, what is this position demonstrating? Other than, hip flexion. Or what concept have we discussed that this demonstrates? So remember, this is our passive insufficiency. Passive insufficiency says that a proximal joint is limited in movement based on the actions of a distal joint. In this case, if my knee were fully extended, it will limit the range of motion at the hip because your calves, rest of your lower leg muscles are going to extend past your knee, kind of causing a pullback from the hip. So essentially makes it so that your hamstrings are tighter quicker. So there's tension on them earlier. So you can't get full range of hip motion unless the knee is flexed. You'll see a similar thing happen in extension, where you need to have knee extension to get full hip extension. Because if I bend or flex my knee, then I experience another insufficiency there with the hip. You're not going to get full extension of the hip when the knee is flexed. So that would be active insufficiency. Active insufficiency, movement of a distal joint limits movement of a proximal joint. Passive insufficiency is lack of movement of a distal joint limits active movement of a proximal joint. Does that all make sense? All right, so that's really everything I wanted to cover with the hip here. So what kind of questions do you all have so far with the hip? Pretty straightforward with that. Okay, what I want to do for the rest of class here is I'm going to review with you for your next exam. So I'm going to go ahead and stop recording this.